I learned a lot about the Pac-12 from this guy, Pac-12 network analyst Yogi Roth, joining me on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. Am I off base here, Yogi, in saying that the majority of college football fans will buy into the Big 12 or Pac-12 more if Washington's able to go into Auburn or go into Atlanta and beat the Auburn Tigers in that opener?
Yeah, no, it's huge. I mean, it kind of like we talked about, and thanks for having me back on, man. That was a blast when we got to talk a week or so ago. It's a critical game for the reputation of the conference because the facts of the conference, when you look at stats or numbers, just aren't received. That's why week one's so huge. You can go back to when Stanford played Northwestern a couple of years ago in week one in a 9 a.m. game. They lose, a tight game, kind of ugly. Like a lot of people in week one, just don't play great. Mm-hmm. And you could argue at the end of the year when they smoked Iowa, they probably would have played Bama the best, just with their offensive line, obviously Christian McCaffrey, Kevin Hogan. I mean, they were loaded, right? But the reputation of the conference took a huge hit, and nobody cares about 9 conference games or 6 straight conference opponents versus the schedule that, say, Alabama has, which is, built to go win. And you got to give the SEC props for doing that because there's clearly a strategy involved with a week 11 opponent and not really a lot of tough back-to-back-to-back games, let alone road games, that any of the top teams see in that conference. So it's huge to set the reputation up for the Pac-12 because I don't know if anybody's going to go undefeated in the Pac-12 conference schedule for the reasons I just referenced and the things that happen throughout a season that are told that, multiple conference games just take on you back-to-back with really only one team in this conference that's down compared to other conferences around the country.
I think the big storyline of the SEC, obviously the new coaches, the Tua Jalen situation at Alabama and who ends up being the starting quarterback, I think is overblown because Alabama will beat you with either one of them. I think for the Big Ten, obviously with all of this Urban Meyer news that we've been discussing today over the last, it seems like 2.5 hours, that's a big news. What is the biggest storyline going into Pac-12 football this year?
I think it varies, right? I mean, prior to the game, they had the Pac-12 conference is the biggest coaching hire, you could argue, in the last 5-7 years with Chip Kelly. When Chris Peterson went to UW, it was huge because everybody courted him. When Urban Meyer went to Ohio State, that was big. But Chip Kelly's known, and will go down in history as being a guy who changed college football. His style of play has influenced every level. We've seen it in the NFL. Everybody can go to the Eagles last year in the Super Bowl and his style of play, or the Patriots and spreading it out. He's impacted it. So to get him when every school in the country was throwing everything at him to this conference, I think is the biggest curiosity, the biggest get. Clearly all the new coaches are huge, from Kevin Sumlin. You go to, from A&M with Johnny to now Khalil Tate, 2 dynamic quarterbacks. And this is a team that is loaded. So that's exciting. Herm Edwards is exciting just because of the uniqueness, clearly, of that situation. But overall for me, I look at this thing and I see the teams at the top, right? I see Bryce Love coming back for Stanford. We never see that at the running back position. I see UW being loaded with a 4-year starter at quarterback. We very rarely see that. A guy who is, can play at the level of Jake Browning can when he's healthy. And then I look at SC, loaded in defense and might play a kid who should be a senior in high school at quarterback, at a position that might be the most historic place to play that position in the history of the game, or at least in the last 20 years. So that's where I go. But I think there's a lot this year, which makes it a really appealing season out west.
Pac-12 network analyst Yogi Roth on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line, joining Peter Burns, sitting in for Will Kane today. Yogi, I don't know much about Bryce Love. And what I mean by that is I don't know much of him, the kid. I know of him as the player, but then there was news about him not participating in media days. What was the background of that, and why were people so bent out of shape?
Well, yeah, I mean, that to me was really misguided, and I'm a huge fan of Dennis Dodd, but come on, man, what are we talking about? I mean, we have all these debates about, are they student athletes? And then we have a student athlete and we want to light them up for it? Like, let's be serious here for a minute. I mean, I really look at Bryce, and number one, he's gifted. You look at the plays he made last year, the amount of missed tackles that he forced. Everybody knew he was getting the rock. They had inconsistent play at quarterback. Had an electric year and, earned the invitation to New York City. And then for him to come back at that position, uncommon. To come back to graduate, take 20 units at Stanford. It's not like he's at a school in another conference that everybody can get in and we could name a lot of schools like that. This is Stanford, and nobody's going to disagree with the academic prowess there. So I was shocked by that. And then we never even celebrated the fact that he did everything he could to do it. You know, like he came on our show on the Pac12 networks. He came out and talked back with the media. And I don't think that Bryce being there or not being there in person is going to impact how he's perceived. What I hope happens, and I've said this since, you know, being honored to have a vote in the Heisman starting last year, that if you're a voter and the definition of the award is excellence with integrity, it's your job to have a standard in which you vote with excellence and integrity, and watch the snaps and have a process in which you vote for your Heisman candidates and look at all the things that go into that. I don't think that happened with Christian McCaffrey when 10% of the voters voted prior to the Pac-12 title game when he went for over 200 all-purpose yards against SC, and I think it cost him the Heisman. And same thing with Bryce. It didn't cost him the Heisman last year, but I think for people to say they don't know a lot about him, and the people whose job is to know a lot about him, I think need to lean in a little bit more, to be quite honest with you.
Well, and therein lies the rub, right? Because I look at and going to a different team, when you start looking at Chris Peterson, Peterson's not a Mike Leach media guy, right? Like he's not a, hey, look at me, or he's not Butch Jones with all this saying. It looks like the accountant that lives next door, and that he's going to play good, safe football. And guess what? They're awfully good. Does Peterson need to change that persona, or does the world need to appreciate what Chris Peterson is doing at Washington a little bit more?
Well, I think Chris Peterson's a 1%er, man. I mean, I got to work with Coach Carroll for 4 years and write his book. You know, I've been lucky to be given this craft where I get to meet with coaches all over the country a lot. Chris Peterson's at the top of the list. You know, you play the game of, if you're stuck on an island, who would you want to go with and who would you hang with? I'd pick Chris Peterson. And when you get to know him, he's got a spirit that's infectious. He's fun-loving. He's crazy competitive. This is a guy who's lived pretty much every experience in football to a large degree, right? JC, small college, worked his way up, obviously head coach in, you know, not a Power 5 school, Boise State, crushed it with his ingenuity, and then comes here to UW, and in a short period of time has made this program one that is really taken on the rest of the country. And I say that because I was at the opening, which, if you don't know what that is, it's kind of football heaven for high school football recruits.
Right.
And rising seniors basically go to Dallas, Texas, top players at all positions, 162 of them. And I'm talking to players, and it's like, hey, who are you looking at? And it's Bama, it's Clemson, and UW's in the conversation. And I'm saying, wow, didn't hear that before. SC would be in it. Oregon sometimes would in it because of the way they recruit. But UW's consistently in it. And, you know, they beat a lot of teams last year in the SEC on Brandon Cajo, a linebacker for them, or a couple of players. So I think he's got more swag than people have any idea about. I think when you look at his team and the way that he develops guys off the field, it's really, really unique. I think when you talk to the players who leave his program, it's different than when you talk to players who leave a lot of other programs. And I think it's a perfect fit for his personality type, because he doesn't have to be a character to gain attention for his program. And he doesn't have to be a quote unquote character like in the SEC. I feel like you go there and it's like you have to be the most stoic coach of all time. He's just him. And being Chris Peterson, it's going to be really hard to make it in his program. They don't offer a lot of guys. I think they've offered, you know, the second or third lowest in the Pac-12, one of the lowest in Power 5s. And they had no decommits last year in the early signing period. If you look at that stat, 18 commits, 18 signees, that's their program. That's the consistency. And I think they're really building something that's a little bit more unique than other programs on the West Coast, and completely can compete with the rest around the country because how they're developing, identifying, recruiting, and then, you know, kicking guys out to the league and into the real world. I think they're guys that every program would be proud to have in their squad. And I think a lot of guys on the West Coast do that, you know, and it is a different beast out here. It's a different style of play. It's a different energy. It's a different community. It's a different, obviously, socioeconomic background. There's a lot of different things out here, and that's why I think Chris is just a perfect fit for UW.
Well, and we'll see it. If he's a perfect fit and they go out there and they beat Auburn in Atlanta, it's going to be a monster performance for them. And, again, I can't wait to see what they're going to be able to do, as well as Khalil Tate, Kevin Sumlin, David Shaw, Mike Leach, even Herm. There's going to be fun. He covers it very well. He's Pac-12 Network analyst Yogi Roth on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. Yogi, we appreciate the time. We'll talk to you soon, right?
Anytime, brother. Enjoy the rest of the very mellow day in college football.
Yeah, nothing
right?
going on in college football, right? Well, we'll talk more about that coming up next. ESPN Radio is presented by Progressive Insurance. We will also continue our conversation about Urban Meyer, what should and should not happen as details continue to trickle in. And the best part of my really super 9.5 on a scale of 10 awkward interview with Adam Schefter coming up next on The Will Cain Show. Peter Burns filling in on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app.